we've had debates for a very long time where it's like, are they, stochastic parrots? Like, do they, just like kind of like match to the most similar training data? Like, or do they like generalize? What is generalization? What does that even mean? And I think what's really cool about this work, what really like gets me excited is we can just talk about the mechanism, and then we can debate like, you know, what does it mean that this is the mechanism? But we can at least start from a common ground and be like,
all right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the TWIML AI podcast. I am your host, Sam Charrington. Today, I'm joined by Emmanuel Ameisen. Emmanuel is a research engineer at Anthropic. Before we get going, be sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to today's show. Emmanuel, welcome back to the podcast.
thanks, Sam. It's good to be back. It's been a while.
It has been a bit. It's been 3 years, almost like in a couple of weeks. It'll be 3 years since we recorded that last episode, and we were chatting a little bit beforehand. We know one another personally, and we can't remember the last time we saw each other. It's been too long, like 10 lifetimes in AI years, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's okay. Nothing happened in the last 3 years. There hasn't been any development that matters. So
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. You've been at Anthropic how long now?
for about 2 years. It'll be 2 years in a month.
Okay. So it's definitely longer than a couple of years. I think you were probably still at Insight the last time we spoke, and I think you did a stint at Stripe maybe after that.
Yeah, that's right. So it must have been a while back. I think when I was last on, I might have just started at Stripe. I was there for about 3.5 years, or 3 years or so. Yeah. So doing kind of machine learning engineering there more broadly.
And at Anthropic, have you been exclusively focused on interpretability?
I've actually done a bunch of things. When I joined, I initially joined the fine tuning team, and so my first few projects were actually around making Claude better at a variety of kind of very practical tasks. So I worked on making Claude better at SQL, like just writing good SQL, or being better at function calling and tool use, kind of the sort of like in the early days of agentic workflows. Just having models call tools was a big deal. So sort of like working on some of that stuff.
So internal fine tuning as opposed to allowing users to bring their own data and fine tune.
Yeah. I should have said fine tuning here is sort of like fine tuning in the sense of the fine tuning that goes into the Claude model that goes on like Claude on AI and on our API. So it's this sort of like, the process by which we make that sort of like main model that everyone uses rather than like fine tuning for custom use cases.
And so you were saying after fine tuning?
Yeah. So I worked on that for a while. Worked on a variety of things around like models using code and models kind of like using tools. And then about a year ago, I switched to something that's much more research focused, working on interpretability research, which is kind of trying to understand how the models do, what they do at all. If you're familiar with the field, you're like, yes, this makes sense. I think when I talk to friends, they're very confused. They're like, but you made the model. Like, what do you mean you don't understand how it works? But it turns out we have no idea how it works at all. And so we have a whole team and multiple teams actually just trying to understand that. And there's also other groups in the industry and in academia doing the same thing, just trying to understand, well, like, how are these models doing what they're doing?
And our conversation today is going to focus on a couple of papers that you and your team have recently published. The first one is called Circuit Tracing, Revealing Language Model Computational Graphs. And the next is called On the Biology of a Large Language Model. I think of those two and the way they fit together as the circuit tracing paper is kind of talking about some of the tooling and mechanisms that you've developed for this particular approach at mechanistic interpretability. and the On Biology paper as being some of the results you've seen in the application of those tools. Is that the way you think about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Maybe a metaphor we've used here that I think makes sense is, in a way, like some of the work we've done is akin to like building a microscope of sorts, and like at least some tool that allows us to look inside the model a little bit as it does things. And so there's the, well, how do you build a microscope? It's like, well, we chose like to sort of like, this is actually like how light refracts off of the lens in that other one, and that's the like circuit tracing paper, and we talk a lot about the various pitfalls, the various like trade-offs we've made, that sort of stuff. And then there's, okay, well, now you have a microscope. Let's look at some cells. And that's the biology one. And this one is mostly, you know, okay, uh, the insights here are less about like how we got there. We of course use the microscope to get there, but they're about like, oh, it looks like, this is how Claude does math, or it looks like this is how Claude, like this is the mechanism that causes Claude to hallucinate sometimes. So it's much more about like uh, the biology of a model, like studying its behavior rather than sort of like the building of the tool.
We're going to dig into both of those areas, but I wonder if it makes sense to start with like, what is the thing that you learned in all this about the models that you found kind of the most surprising or that most challenged the way you think about large language models?
It's funny. After like before releasing the papers, but after doing some of the experiments, someone on our team like asked everyone, kind of, we have 10 or so case studies in biology, and they're like, well, how many of those were like surprising to you? And reflecting, back on it and on what I was expecting, I would say that about like half to two-thirds of them were surprising to me. And then of course, you sort of like published a paper, and some of the reaction to all of them is like, well, like this is obvious. Like why wouldn't the model work in this way? From other people. And so like I think sometimes it can be harder to appreciate what's surprising, but I can give you like maybe a couple ones that definitely were surprising to me. Um, One is this like poetry example, and we use poetry because writing a rhyming poem is something that's like pretty hard to do if you're just like predicting one word at a time, which is how these models work, right? They like have a prompt, they predict one word, they add that word to their prompt, they predict the next one, and so on. And so you might say like, well, okay, that seems like it would make it really hard to write it, good poetry, which most models can do, or if not good, let's say rhyming poetry.
You'd expect the model to greedy optimize itself into a corner pretty easily.
Exactly. It would get to the end of the rhyme, and then it'd be like, "Oh, now I
Oh,
have to
damn.
rhyme with orange." And it's like, "Ugh, well, it turns out actually that's a hard rhyme, and also I didn't think about it." But still, you can imagine like, well, maybe if you have enough data, it just kind of like always picks, sentences that kind of make sense, and it gets to the rhyme, and there's some like murky thing. But it turns out that what we found when we looked at it was that when this is Claude 3.5 haiku, like is given a rhyming couplet. The example we used in the paper is he saw a carrot and had to grab it. The model then completes that with his hunger was like a starving rabbit. So it rhymes using rabbit, which is fine. It turns out that when it processes grab it and then comma and then new line and then it's about to write the second line, at that point before it writes the first word of the second line, there are features which we can explain kind of what they are a bit, but there's like representations in the model's circuits for the word rabbit. um, it's already decided in a way, if you want to say decided, that it's going to end with rabbit. And then it uses those representations not just to like choose rabbit at the end. It's not just that it's chosen that, it's that they're also um, causally involved. Like they help guide the choice of all of the words before leading to rabbit. And we know this because we see it in the circuit, but also because we kind of want to validate this outside of our methods. We just perform a bunch of tests where we like delete rabbit and we add like a random word in the paper. We had like green, and then the model rewrites the sentence completely. And I think the sentence it lands on is something like the farmer's field was verdant green or something. So it like completely changes its sentence so that it can end with its plan. But so that example of sort of like pretty complex, longer horizon behavior was definitely one that kind of like stuck with me as something that you might not expect if you were just like, well, they're just autocomplete on steroids, predicting the next token. Like they're sort of like not doing anything complicated. Turns out they are in some context.
And I think with that as kind of context, it makes sense to jump into circuit tracing because the immediate question, on hearing that example and the others presented in the work is like, how do you know? How do you know? So let's jump into circuit tracing to talk a little bit about or contextualize the approach that you've taken in the broader context of interpretability. And maybe as to get that started, like, are you only focused on mechanistic interpretability there, or do you explore other types of interpretability research?
Right now, we're mainly focused on, or at least for this work, we're mainly focused on mechanistic interpretability. And I can sort of like, yeah, maybe I can contextualize kind of what even is circuit tracing, and also maybe like why do you need it? Just really briefly, right? Which is that you know, um, in past jobs doing machine learning, I've used models that weren't kind of transformers and models like that were maybe like decision trees. And decision trees are commonly used in like fintech and fraud prevention and stuff like that. And they have this really nice property that they're exactly what they sound like. They're this tree of decisions. And so once you've trained your model, you can kind of look at it and say like, like the reason that the model said, we should block this transaction is because the amount was over $10,000 and it was going to like a bank account in the like Cayman Islands or something. And you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Whereas if it said, if the like individual branches made less sense, you'd be a little more suspicious. And so that's a really nice property of these simpler models. Turns out transformers, not at all like that. The complete opposite, right? The way that they work is they have these kind of like giant vectors of numbers, of hundreds or thousands of numbers that represent each word or each token, and then those get processed by like a series of, again, basically oftentimes millions, billions of computations, and at the end, the model predicts a word, and kind of like what happens in between. If you look at like all of these numbers is just like completely unclear. Like you can go in your like Jupyter notebook and you can look at the numbers and you can say, like, yes, when Claude was like writing poetry, this is the sequence of like a billion numbers or whatever that was in its activations. But that's sort of like, so what, you know? It's maybe like, yeah, similar to sort of like looking at like a tangled mess of like cables or circuitry inside a computer. And it's like, well, you could just look at what lights up, but you kind of like, you need to somehow like map your observation to like what the model is actually thinking about. And so that's the nature of the problem. Um, and then I would say that the sort of like circuit tracing is step two on maybe like a 3-step plan. Step one would be, um, well, can you understand like what the model is representing at all? And this is kind of the reason for working on dictionary learning, which was kind of the topic of the two previous papers before these two.
You said dictionary learning.
Yes, yeah, which is like broadly here, like the idea is, can you take this like dense mess of numbers inside the model when it's like, let's say, processing one word or one sentence, and decompose it in a bunch of like unique concepts, so that if the model is processing the prompt like, I'm taking my car over the Golden Gate Bridge, you might expect that like, okay, so you see this massive numbers, but in it there's going to be like a concept for the Golden Gate Bridge and a concept for car and a concept for like a fun weekend with friends or something. um, and so the goal of dictionary learning is that it's like, okay, can you basically decompose representations into a like sparse version that's sort of like understandable? And we do that importantly like in an unsupervised manner. Basically, like you train a completely other model that's going to be your dictionary, and that's going to like decode the innards of your base model, and then you can like on a given prompt you can look and you can say, oh, look, Claude was thinking about this or thinking about that. And that was the paper that was prior to these most recent ones, and sort of we found a bunch of interesting things there. We found, kind of like very nuanced representations. There's like representations for like people being like sycophantic, meaning like praising you even when they don't meaning. There's like they don't mean it. There's like representations for like typos and bugs in code. There's like a bunch of different representations inside the model that are like fascinating. Um, and then I'll pause maybe, but I'll say one more thing, which I'll say like, okay, that's the first step. And then so what's the second step? Well, what you'd really want is like, this is kind of like finding, you have this like jumbled soup now of all of the things that the model is thinking about. But what you don't have is you don't have a way to explain like, okay, but why did the model say what it said? Or even why did the model think about the Golden Gate Bridge? Like it's probably because in the prompt there was like Golden Gate Bridge and it like those three words are enough to think about that versus other bridges. But now we want to connect all these representations and have basically like a circuit, which is just like a list of steps in order, where it's like it went from this one to that one to this one to that one, and then that's why it said this. And the effort of circuit tracing is that.
Nice. And thinking about the dictionary work and the idea of representations of concepts, one of the things that jumped out to me is that this, is very similar to the ideas of like embedding, words into a vector space, and you have these areas that represent distinct concepts, but it's not exactly embedding. It's more, um, maybe the right way to ask the question is, does the kind of results that you see like follow directly from embedding and embedding as a concept, embeddingness, and the fact that models kind of operate on these vectors, or is there a distinct concept of concept relatedness in the context of the model itself?
It's definitely related. So, the models themselves, right? They take in, as you mentioned, embeddings for their words, and then but then what happens is sort of like two things. Um, they process these embeddings and like output, different vectors essentially. And so it's like, like maybe if you so an example we have in the paper is like, facts. Michael Jordan plays the sport of, and then, basketball is the completion that the model successfully gets to. And it's like, well, how does it know this? Well, one thing that models do is like they take the embedding for Jordan, which is like that's just a token, they've learned it, and then there's like various pieces of the model that like read this embedding and will like, for example, write like basketball or um Space Jam, or the Chicago Bulls. And so there's sort of like um these like um embeddings are your starting point, but then you have like a lot more nuance about like various sort of like either like various aspects of like decomposing a given embedding something or like combining them, right? If you have, I don't know, uh Michael Jordan and LeBron, then maybe you're going to have like some parts of the model that are combining those and sort of like starting to have features for like discussing who's the greatest basketball of all time, right? Like debates about greatness is probably a feature you'll see there. And so they're sort of like the way to think about it is that like the nuances of concepts that can be represented in the model is much, it's almost like a combinatorial explosion on top of your embeddings, right? You have like your kind of like base embeddings, and then you can kind of like combine them in various ways. And then, the way you combine them is you might have like an embedding for like street and then an embedding for like, I don't know, main street, first street, second street, third street. But then you also are going to have a direction in the model that's like, Main Street in like Texas, maybe, or Main Street in Arizona. You can sort of like combine them in arbitrary ways. And so what we're trying to understand are sort of these like more complex and nuanced representations inside the model after it's consumed embeddings and before it's output. Uh, 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 Basically a next word prediction.
Yeah, I'll tell you where that came up for me was the example about was trying to get at whether there's this kind of linguistic universality, and so it had the Claude 3.5 haiku model, like translating the same phrase in several different languages, and asked it to get the opposite of like convert big to small or something like that.
Yeah. The opposite of
And
big is, yeah.
yeah, and it struck me in a lot of ways as like the classic word to vec kind of relationship, king minus man plus woman. The question that prompted for me was like, do these results kind of just follow directly from embedding? And I like the insight that, uh, you know, yes, they're related, but the concept of embedding within the model is so much richer than the kinds of concepts that are represented in the vector space.
Yeah, and I think that like the those results are actually like a really good example of this, and we can like dig in a little more in that like so the comparison we make in the biology paper on this is like if you do that's I think it's the opposite of large is small, and uh, le contraire de grand est petit, which is like the French version, and you can do like we do different languages. What you find is that like initially there's like of course, different embeddings for those because they're different tokens. And then in as the sort of like signal progresses through the model, the features, so these representations, start being shared. Like there's a shared representation of something that is big. There's a shared representation of something that is the opposite across all languages. Um, and that I think kind of is an example of what I was saying a little bit earlier, which is like all of the embeddings for like big and large and all of the other languages, they share at least one facet, right? Which is that they're about something that's big. There's many other facets that they don't share. Like one of them starts with B, the other starts with L. They have like different number of letters, whatever. There's like a bunch of ways in which they're different. They're in different languages, but they share that. And so the model sort of like you know in processing these different languages, like extracts the shared representation, and then does its computation. Where it's like there's largest, there's opposite, so I have to say something small, and then goes back to the language that it was asked in. And so in the paper, right, we're like, well, if it's truly a shared kind of like set of representations, surely that means that you can kind of like mess with them and like plug one for the other, or like you can use the same like flip large to small in the like kind of like shared space, and it will do the same thing for all languages, and surely it does, meaning that like we don't need to find a different concept of like opposite in French and Chinese and English. It's just we found the concept of opposite for the model here, and we turn it on, it works for all languages. um, which yeah, so again, it's like an aspect of it's like something more nuanced than the original embedding, right? It's like extracted some like aspect that is shared, and it is useful for it to sort of like generalize when it's learning across languages, right? That's also an important implication here, is that like that allows you to learn something in a French text and then be able to like apply that same circuit that you learned in texts of other languages.
So getting back to how this works and how the kind of tooling and methodologies you've developed to, understand these models, a couple of key concepts are, replacement model and sparse coding. Can you talk about, the mechanisms a bit?
Maybe I'll start with source coding because so right. So the idea is actually similar both for this new paper and for the sort of like dictionary learning papers. It's the same approach basically. And the idea is like, you have, say in the middle of the model, you have this like, yeah, as we said, it's like the very dense, you know, vector of numbers. And in that vector, you're pretty sure, are all these representations. There's like the representative large, the representation of like opposite, but all you see is this like dense vector of numbers. And what you want is you want to know, like actually the model is thinking a little about this concept A and a little about this concept B and a little about this concept C. So like this is just a method to get at that. And the way that you get at this method is you say, cool, can I learn a separate model that will take this like incomprehensible mess, this dense vector, and that will learn a like essentially you do like a matrix multiply to a like much larger space. Um, and then you take this space, and that space you force to be very sparse. And so you literally like have, if you have, let's say for example, like 100 neurons somewhere in the middle of your model, so you have 100 numbers that are kind of like always active and like very hard to comprehend. You blow it up to 1,000 numbers, and you have a constraint that says that, like, basically in your loss, you penalize every time one of those numbers is not zero. So the models are going to have to be like very, very parsimonious in allocating these features. It's not going to be able to turn many of them on. And then so that's sort of like where the sparse comes from. But then you have to make sure that you're actually capturing as much as you can. So then what you do is you try to reconstruct the original thing from that code. And so it's like you're learning a sparse code, and then you're also like making sure that your sparse code is enough to capture like as much of the original thing as possible. And so that's basically like the gist of dictionary learning. You're training with this mix of like sparsity and reconstruction error, where it's like how well can you reconstruct after you've blown it up and put it back together. Um, and that is sort of like what gives you these features, which we call like monosemantic, meaning they kind of like represent only one thing. Um, so that's sparse coding. So okay, so that you could do before, and we did before for sort of like representations inside the model. Maybe at this point, like a useful mental model to have is like I have it as like a tiramisu, where you have you have like the input tokens at the bottom or the sentence, so it's like the fact Michael Jordan plays the sport of is like at the bottom, and then the model has like successive layers where it's like it transforms this into numbers, and then it does some computation, basically like some math, aka some matrix multiplications, and then has another set of vectors, one for each of the tokens, and then it does that again, it does that again, it does that again, it does that again. And eventually, it does a final multiplication to still do the output. And so what we're doing in the previous papers is like applying this method in between computations and seeing like, okay, it's done a bunch of computations, we're somewhere in the middle. Let's look at what the model is thinking about now, basically. Um, the problem with that is that you can see what the model's thinking about, but you kind of don't know what the computation is doing at all. You could see it to the extent that you're like, well, before it was thinking about bridge and gold, and now it's thinking about the Golden Gate Bridge, and so probably like somewhere like there's some part of the model that like stitched those together to understand this. And so in circuit tracing, we use transcoders, which basically what those do is they do the same thing, but you you try to replace the computation with this sparse thing instead of just the representation. So we're now just like completely replacing bits of the model with this like sparse thing, and we're trying to make it so that the computation stays the same, but it's super sparse and understandable. Um, and that's like the main idea of the replacement model is like you try to replace chunks of the base model with another model that's as close as possible, while being much more explainable and understandable.
In doing so, you have several different choices for the type of replacement model you use, cross-layer transcoders versus SAEs versus others. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose the approach that you chose?
So there's kind of like a space of trade-offs here. Um, so you know, going from SAEs, which are these like, oh, just do it on the neurons, to transcoders is kind of nice because that allows you to um, one to like understand the computation rather than just representation, but then also once you've replaced these parts of the model, you can then directly like connect features to features. You can say like, oh, like this feature like at this layer uh writes in that direction because like now you've replaced a part of the model, so the feature is just like a computation. It's like, the computation writes that direction, and then this other feature reads in this direction. And so actually they don't talk to each other at all. But those features go in the same direction, and so they talk to one another. And so you can then like have
Wait,
very.
what does that mean? What does directionality mean here?
All right, I
In
thought
a
I was going to be
concrete
able to
way.
sneak that one by you. Um, so yeah, so the way that here what we're replacing is MLP layers, which are like multi-layer perceptrons, and what they are is, so you have this like representation with 100 numbers, and basically you um let's just take like one neuron, or one neuron of your MLP, which all it does is it like um does like multiplies your your 100 numbers by another 100 numbers to get like some float, and then multiplies that by like a decoder. And that decoder, what is it? It's also again 100 numbers. And so like, the way that it's usually taught in like machine learning textbooks is you have your neurons, and then you have like a matrix multiplication, another matrix multiplication. But another way to look at it is that each of those, all it's doing is it's saying like, I take the current uh, vector of neurons, I like multiply it with another vector, which basically just like is kind of equivalent to seeing like how aligned are they essentially, right? And then I take the result of that and I scale a second vector by that. And so it's like I read in that direction and I write to that direction. So I read in that direction. So that means that like, oh, if like there's stuff in that direction, it will activate this neuron. If there's not, the neuron will stay like 0. And then I write in that direction, meaning, if I've activated this neuron, I'm going to write this other thing.
So you can think of it geometrically as like trying to capture the similarity of two vectors and then projecting them off into another direction.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. And so once you have that, then you can ask questions about like, well then like how do those compose? Right. So it's like, oh, I had one like earlier in the model that like computed the similarity projected in that direction. And then this other one is computing a similarity with this other direction. Are those direction aligned or are they not? And if they are aligned, then that means that like this feature will actually like activate this other feature. And so you'll see like, oh, you have a feature that like reads, I don't know, like reads in the direction that's like the like makes like red and bridge and writes like golden. And then you have another feature that like reads the golden direction and also is like gonna sort of like tend to upweight like things about the Golden Gate Bridge. Um, is like the rough idea. And so that's what transcoders buy you. They buy you sort of like easier edges between your features, which then is kind of what you want with circuits is you want to like connect them all.
Yeah, given the dimensionality that we're talking about, like how do you even grok these directions? Like, are you applying like dimensionality reduction types of techniques to understand what's happening here, or are there other ways that you're kind of getting at like what direction means for these vectors?
I mean, I think you just have to like try hard to reason in 10,000 dimensional space. And that, um, so it doesn't seem that hard. No, so the good thing is we actually don't have to think about them. That's part of the pros of the method. And the reason we don't is that like, so um, let me like walk through how you actually use this in practice. You have a prompt. You've replaced a bunch of your model so that it has these like kind of like simpler or like more understandable, bits of computation that like read in one direction and write in another one. You take your prompt, you pass it through, you look at what these do, right? And all you do is you don't even like look at this like, dimension, whatever, um, vector. You just do the dot products to see if they're aligned. And that gives you a number, right? Kind of like when you're, in geometry. And so when we show these like attribution graphs, that's all they are is they're like a boiled down version of like very, very high dimensional space where all we're showing is like each edge is basically like, like what was the dot product between this like, super big vector and that super big vector? And it's like, was it positive? Was it negative? And that's just a number between, 1 over minus infinity and plus infinity, but it's just a number. So you can understand that pretty easily and be like, oh, there's a bunch of strong edges from like the like golden to the like this is a bridge feature. That makes sense. And so yes, so yeah, we don't have to. I mean, there's a bunch of things you might want to do to understand these vectors and like, you know, um but for the purpose of drawing this computational graph, you get to abstract over it, which is really nice. One thing you will find though is that it turns out that in these models, there's actually a lot of like amplification. And so when we were doing these early experiments, we would find that like a lot of our graphs were just very boring. And what I mean by that is we have this example in the paper where you ask like the model basically to tell you, I think it's like what's the capital of Denmark, or like Copenhagen is the capital of, and there's a Copenhagen feature, and then you're like, oh, I wonder what that feature is connected to, And it turns out it's connected to a Copenhagen feature in the second layer. And you're like, oh, I wonder where that goes to. And it turns out that that one's connected to a Copenhagen feature in the third layer. And so actually, like, the graph would just be like Copenhagen, 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 and then Denmark at the end. And that's because of the way these models work, they can't delete things. And so if you want to still be thinking about Copenhagen, you have to sort of like have every layer reinforced, be like, yeah, we're still thinking about Copenhagen. This is still the right thing we're thinking about. And so that's where our other method comes into place, this like cross-layer thing, where we instead try to like learn features that like skip over all of these. And so like instead of having like 10 Copenhagens, you have one. And that's the sort of like idea between the like cross-layer transcoder. But it's sort of, it's nice for that property, but I would say it's like not vital for sort of like the method itself, if that makes sense.
So you've got this method that you're using to um, replace the MLP blocks in the transformer, um, and that method results in a degree of introspectability, visibility into the way the model is thinking. Um, one thought that I had was, it's kind of like an ad nauseum type of an argument. Like, if you can do that, like, it sounds almost like distilling the black box model to an interpretable model, or whatever the opposite of distilling would be, because this thing's going to have a lot more, but more sparsely populated uh, weights. Like, could you just like upstill it into, a black box into like an understandable thing, and like just use that thing? And I'm really asking this to try to get at uh, like a concrete understanding of this process. Like, would it be too slow, or like, is it not really? I know you're doing some alignment between the replacement models and the actual model to ensure that the results are, meaningful, right? But is it, not very accurate after you've, done this training process? Are you only doing a small number of MLPs at a time in a larger model, or and you couldn't possibly, from a computational perspective, do all of them? Like, I'm trying to get at like some practicalities of the approach.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, those are great questions. So, I mean, I will say like ignoring sort of, money or physics for a second, which is always fun. Um, if, if we, given like unlimited money and like probably like limit of infinite data and stuff like that, you could totally imagine, yeah, doing, okay, great. Let's like replace the whole model with this interpretable alternative, and then let's run it instead. And then we just get we just get a free lunch basically, where we have something that's as good as the base model, and also we can understand it. Now, in actuality, as you said, it's more like upstilling than distilling. So like because all of the layers are way wider, even if I could give you this perfect model, actually it'd be really expensive to serve, right? Because it's like it just like is a way bigger object than the base model. There's also kind of like a question of training costs. So in our biggest Haiku 3.5 runs were 30 million features, and those are pretty big runs. But if you think of the number of features as sort
And
of
a
like the number,
feature is multiplicative of the number of parameters. It's a vector as opposed to a.
that's right. Well, right. And if you're doing the per layer thing, then like a feature is sort of like an encoder and decoder, so like two vectors. But if you're doing this like cross layer thing, the way that it works is that a feature like is like one encoder and then like n layers decoders. So it's actually quite expensive. Um, but that sort of like is still worth it because you need fewer features because you're like deleting a bunch of redundant features. So there's this sort of like that's why it's still worth doing. But anyways, yeah, our feature is like when we're on the order of like one maybe like close to, let's say, like what a neuron in MLP would cost you. And 30 million of them is a lot, but think about how many independent concepts the model knows. And so there's this sort of like, we call it the like dark matter problem in the paper. There's a sort of problem that, how many features would we need so that we captured everything that Claude knows? Currently using our methods, that's probably in the order of like billions. maybe. And so that's like quite infeasible with sort of like just today's techniques. It would cost way too much to train. It'd be completely impossible to like even study. It'd be this giant monster. And so there's a sense in which, in order to capture everything in the model is doing, and so to both explain it fully, but also to be able to kind of like reconstruct it accurately, we need so many features that right now this is sort of still basically an unsolved problem. I think one thing that's relatively clear, and that again we talk about in the paper, is we're going to need to sort of like think of smart ways to you know, get features more efficiently, or get features more efficiently only in like a domain that we care about. Maybe we don't care to explain how Claude does everything. Maybe we only care to explain how Claude does math, or how Claude does like pi or something. That buys us a lot. But also there's a bunch of methods that you can imagine using to just like be more efficient with your features, that we discussed a little bit. So I think that the sort of like summary answer to your question is that's the dream. I think that right now, the sort of like realistic state we're in is actually we can explain what some of what the model is doing some of the time. And I think the sort of like first step after that is like, can we just keep increasing the proportion of times that we kind of like understand what's going on? Um, and I don't know if we'll ever get to the dream of we just replace the model with the interpretable model. But I think even if we just manage to sort of like understand a lot more, we'll get a lot of value here.
There was some discussion that I found really interesting, talking about kind of one of the challenges or confounders being these ideas of polysemanticity and superposition. Talk a little bit about those ideas.
So I guess like one thing you might think is like, why do we need to do this at all? The model already has neurons. We could just use them and then do our graphs based on that. And it turns out that if you just look at the neurons and you try to understand them the way that we try to understand features, which is like, you know, uh, run it on a bunch of text and see what makes it light up, and see if when you look at that pattern, it's obvious what it does. So for features like the Golden Gate Bridge feature, it's like if you do that, you run it on like a bunch of text and you highlight the parts where it lights up. It's like, oh, it's like you're literally just highlighting the text to Golden Gate Bridge in a bunch of text, and everything else it's just off. Very clear. Most neurons are not like that at all. Most neurons, you look at them and you're sort of like, like it seems to fire on sevens sometimes, but only if there was like Russian language before, and also, like German cookbooks. And or like even that is actually like kind of understandable. It's like mostly just looks kind of random. And so that's because um actually like each neuron kind of like isn't a meaningful unit for the model, and the model just like uses a bunch of neurons in parallel and stores sort of like representations over all of them. And so those neurons are what we like polysemantic. They just like don't have a single meaning, whereas the features are monosemantic. They have like, you can say like, this is the Michael Jordan feature. If it like has a very high activation, that means the model is thinking a lot about Michael Jordan. If it doesn't, it's not. um and so the idea of superposition then is, well, like how do you reconcile this idea that there are features that are sort of like very meaningful and very sparse, with the fact that if you look inside the model, it's like a very dense thing where like every kind of like, in the residual stream of the model, which is where kind of like information uh is processed, just everything is on all the time. There's no sparsity. And that's because, at least the hypothesis is that it's because of essentially like superposition. What's happening is that the model is like storing many more features than it has dimensions in superposition, and like squishing them tightly, such that when you look at it, it's just this like mess. But actually what's happening is that like each feature is sort of like, smeared across like many dimensions. And our work is to decode that smearing into these like abstract monosemantic things, basically like untangle the superposition to get the monosemantic representations. Is like kind of the name of the game here.
We've touched on limitations of the approach throughout. One that jumped out to me is the idea that by focusing on kind of the replacement of the MLP layers, you're missing out on another big source of information, which is the attention mechanism. Can you talk about that and more broadly, like other limitations?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, you know, attention's the biggest one by far. And so there's a lot of stuff. I mean, there are many other limitations, don't get me wrong. So I guess we touched on one, which was this like dark matter, which is if you just extrapolate how many features we have and how many features we need, we're just not going to get there. So we need to do work to sort of like find a way to do it more efficiently. So that's one. Attention is a huge one because there are many things that the model does that are basically almost entirely done via attention. Maybe, a common example is like, I was gonna say induction, that's like induction is when the model just like looks back at previous instances of the word it's processing and looks at what was said after that word and then just says the same thing. Um, that's maybe like that's interesting, but actually like pretty well understood. But there's a lot of stuff we don't understand, or at least that's harder to understand well. Where you can ask like a a, a, a bunch of questions around. Um, Maybe a better example is like multiple choice questions, where uh, like the model has to, you ask it a multiple choice question, and then at some point it has to say like, well, it's answer B, and the way that it says it's answer B is that there's an attention head that looks at B and then like writes it at the end. And if you if you use our method, that's basically all you see. You're like, ah, great. Like the complete story of what happened on this prompt is that Claude somehow knew that the answer was B, and then like an attention head like moved it there. But of course, the interesting question is like, well, why did this attention head look at B? Like there's some computation that happens in the model that tells it that the correct answer was B, and then like it looks at B and it copies it. And currently, we just completely sidestep that. We sort of like explain part of attention, or at least we explain how attention moves the information from MLPs, but we don't explain why attention patterns were the way they were. And that's like a huge part of how the model processes information is like, how did it decide to attend from X to Y is something that we completely miss. And so, obviously one of the main limitations and kind of aspects that we're interested in working on and in hearing from other groups working on it. Um, I think solving that is by far sort of like the most exciting thing on my list in terms of kind of like next work. I you know I don't think it'll be easy to be clear, but I think it's doable.
Why is it so difficult? Is attention kind of a denser mechanism? Is it more, opaque somehow? Like, they're all numbers somewhere. Like what makes attention more difficult to kind of to pick apart? Can you train some other, like, is there an analogy, like a straightforward analogy of like a sparse replacement attender that, is conceptual, or does the nature of attention, cut off avenues like that?
Yeah. I think there's sort of like a few reasons why attention is hard, but none of them are fundamental. Like you totally could train some sparse replacements for like parts of attention. I think um, attention is just like different in a few ways. Maybe like one way is that um, the other aspects we replace are these sort of like maybe like univariate is the wrong word, but distance, it's like you take the state of the model and then you do your like, you apply your MLP and then you write the result. And so you can replace that. It's like a very clean computation. But attention patterns specifically are the combination of what's happening at all of the key positions and all of the query positions and the interactions between both of those. And so you now have something that's like quadratic basically. And so you have to sort of somehow like find a way to get around that. And there are sort of like proposed approaches, and I think some of them are likely to work, or at least I hope they are.
So a lot of the limitation is just computational bounds for the same reason attention is hard, to scale, for context windows and stuff like that.
Exactly. So that's one of them. I would say another one too is that like um, there's also a like nonlinearity over attention. Like it's not just that you're doing like a K cube, and then you're also doing like your nonlinearity, which then like that just means that it makes your decomposition efforts like you have to think carefully about because in at least in like our graphs, because of our replacement, we've managed to make everything linear. So you can just literally say like, this feature affects that one in that way. But here it's sort of like, yeah, like this this key affected
Kind of
that query in that
obscures
way.
relationships.
Exactly. But like actually what really matters is that that one was much stronger. And so actually there's sort of like you didn't really have an effect at all. Like you are getting squished by the nonlinearity. So I don't know. I guess like maybe another way to say it is that um replacing MLPs first here, this work, um, just gave us enough sort of like valuable empirical insight and valuable work to do that it felt like the first thing to do. And I think, there's similar papers in the field that sort of like have various other, like they use transcoders as well, and that have found success. And then, it's kind of like now that you've solved this, or at least have found, maybe not solved, but found a
Made some
method that works
progress.
well. Yeah. Now you see the sort of like the next thing becomes the gaping hole, right? Like now that it's like, oh, we've patched this hole, like this makes sense. And it's like, oh, and now attention is this huge thing. It's like, why haven't you done anything about attention? It's like, well, we were starting here, and so, but I think it's basically the next kind of like exciting thing.
We've kind of touched on these relationships, but haven't explicitly talked about this concept of an attribution graph, which is kind of like how you make sense of all of this information. Can you talk us through those graphs and like how you create them and what they tell you?
Once you've kind of like replaced these bits of the model with these interpretable bits, you can kind of like, I was alluding to the fact that you can kind of like connect them. So you can say like, this, the model saw, I feel like I'm like bouncing between examples. We're going to pick fact, Michael Jordan plays a sport of, and stick with it for a bit. So the model saw, Michael Jordan, and there's like a feature that, let's say, like reads Jordan and writes, like basketball. There's also a feature that reads Jordan and writes famous people. There's a feature that reads like sport and writes, like talking about sports and talking about sports players. And there's a bunch more of these features on like a given graph. You'll have, hundreds that are just doing various things like extracting meaning, combining meaning from previous features. The attribution graph is just saying, cool, we run the forward pass, we record all of these features, and we just connect them based on, as we were talking about, which ones kind of like write in the same, like which ones write and read in the same direction, such that they like affect each other, basically. And we just show this as a graph. And we go all the way from like the model saying basketball to the embeddings of the tokens. And we see like what is, literally like what is the sort of like computational path that went from this prompt to you saying basketball. And it's like, in this example, there's kind of like two paths where it's like, oh, there's like a path that's Michael Jordan and like a bunch of famous people. And eventually it gets to like, we're talking about basketball. And there's a path that's just like plays the sport of, and that one has a bunch of features about just like popular sports. And so that one kind of like pushes up football, but this path pushes up basketball even more. And so then the model says basketball. And so these graphs give us basically a hypothesis about what the model did. The reason it's a hypothesis is that they're based on this like replacement that we did, and the replacement isn't perfect. And so maybe we're wrong. And so then a huge part of the paper is like, take the graph, and then you can then say like, well, if this graph were true, then like nudging the MLP at like this layer in this direction, which the graph claims is the basketball direction or whatever, would like make the model say basketball or make the model not say basketball. And so then we basically take these graphs and we use them as sources of hypotheses, and we test those by directly intervening on the model.
And those interventions are a big part of um, the biological study. And um, I, I guess there's at least a couple of kinds of interventions, or maybe I have you taxonomize the interventions, but like one of them seems like a nudge, but they're also like you're able to, either insert or delete, um, you know, next words, or like the example with the poem, like you cut off the model's ability to use rabbit as the destination for the next line in the poem. Talk a little bit more about the those interventions, and in particular, are those interventions happening at the replacement space, replacement land, or are they happening in the replacements tell you how to do them in model land? Like, how's it happening?
The replacement model tells you how to do them in model land for the most part. And so for almost all of the experiments, they're sort of like happening in model land. And It's basically how we validate that like the replacement model wasn't lying to us. Um, they're mostly of the same shape. There's like a bunch of variants, as you said, but mostly they kind of like all do the same thing. And the thing they do is like identify a feature, or often it's like a group of features, because we often have like, a bunch of rabbit features instead of just one. Um, and then either like suppress them, meaning like, like as I was saying, they write in a direction. So you just like write less in that direction. And you literally like go at that part of the model and you're like, write less, or like
So now,
equivalently. Yeah.
sorry to jump in, but before we get too far from this, like, you know, this is a little bit of backtracking, but like reconcile the idea that like, we've got this challenge of polysemanticity and superposition. You, you go from kind of the MLP to features in this replacement model. Like, how do you get back? Like, are you getting back to? Individual neurons, or those individual neurons spread all over, MLP or multiple layers, or like,
Once we do the replacement model and we let's keep this like rabbit example, we have this like rabbit feature. Like, what actually is that rabbit feature? You know, Mainly, um, it's like, so it's an encoder, which is like what causes it to fire. But then once the rabbit feature is active, the way that it like influences the model is these like decoders, right? Which is like the MLP down projection in the base model. It's the equivalent in feature space. And so literally, if you take the rabbit feature, you're going to have like, let's say at layer, whatever, like a 5, you're going to have a, um, a vector of shape D model, like the like shape of the residual stream, that is that feature. And so like that's that feature's decoder. For cross-layer transcoders, you actually have like one at every layer, but like I think for now, let's just take one layer. So um you have that feature direction, and you say like, the replace model is telling us that like at MLP layer 5, there's like a rabbit feature, and it has this decoder in that direction. And it is also telling us that if we were to like suppress it, or sometimes we even inject the opposite, which I'll explain what that is in a second, then the model wouldn't end its sentence in rabbit. And so the way we test that is we throw the replacement model away. We keep that vector and we inject this sort of like, this vector times -5 or something, or -10, or like depending on the strength of the intervention. Um, we inject that into the base model. And we see, if when we didn't do the injection, the model was going to end in rabbit. Then we do this injection at this layer.
injection means changing weights, or
It's like, yeah, it's like basically um,
you're multiplying your vector by the weights to get a new set of replacement weights,
you're running your
like
normal
weight
forward
scaling, I
pass.
guess.
It's like you're running your normal forward pass as you would, but then when you're at this like layer 5 MLP, you just add this thing. So or like in our case, subtract. But like if you wanted to add the rabbit feature, you just add this to like what the MLP was going to write, or you like add -10 times. So it's going to like basically the idea is just like you let it do its normal thing, but you just subtract that component from it. Like you have this sort of like theory that a part of what it's doing is writing rabbit and it's doing a bunch of other stuff. And you say, I want you to keep doing exactly what you're doing, but I want to subtract the rabbit direction from what you were doing. So it's like keep the model doing everything else it was doing, because it's doing like other processing to just write a poem at all, but just don't think about rabbits. And then you run the base model. And then in the case of this experiment, right, you see, the model for the rabbit experiment, actually, it turns out it's planned rabbit and habit. And so if you do that, it will just like target habit and write a different sentence that ends in habit. If you then like you do the same thing for both at the same time, it like lands on a different word, etc. That's sort of like every experiment or every like intervention experiment is of that shape in the paper. Um, and so we just like kind of like remove things or add new things to what the base model was doing, and record kind of like the consequence of that experiment. And then that tells us whether our graph was correct or not. And maybe more importantly than telling us whether our graph was correct, it tells us cool things about like what the model is doing, right? It's like kind of forget about the graph. It's like, we found this direction that actually like does seem to be like the direction of the model's plan. And when you mess with it, it changes the model's plan.
So another aspect of that question was like, how do you reconcile that, the ability to do interventions in this way with the idea that the idea of rabbit is like spread all over the model and not just in layer 5?
It turns out that like this kind of varies based on like the cases we've looked at. But yeah, oftentimes like the rabbit ID will be spread over, let's say, like 3 or 5 layers. Sometimes if you just change the first layer, that's enough because actually what they're doing is like amplification. And so it's like those next few layers will only fire
You
if
talked about earlier the idea of like continuing the thought through subsequent layers as a way to preserve it.
exactly, exactly. And so sometimes if you just remove rabbit from the first one, the next few will just not say rabbit because they're like, well, I was just reinforcing what was there and it's not there anymore. So I'm just not going to do that. Or if you inject something else, I'll just reinforce that instead. Um, And then sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes they're each kind of like doing the thing. And so sometimes we kind of like do this injection in a range. It's like I like subtract rabbit from like this guy and the next one and the next one and the next one to prevent them all from thinking about rabbit. Uh, we have some like kind of like more discussion of that in the methods, but I think that's also like there's this notion of um, not only, you know, is the model like spreading its computation over many neurons within one MLP, but it's probably also doing it over like successive MLPs because it doesn't care. Like, it has no incentive to like have understandable layers, right? It could just like compute something over 4 layers in a row, and so that's some of the weirdness that we're confronting here. That sometimes you're like to your point, like rabbit is a concept, but it's like spread across neurons and spread across layers a little bit.
I was going to ask along those lines, have you made any observations that relate, for example, a concrete concept like rabbit is more concentrated, in some way in the model versus a more abstract concept like oppositeness or, any of the, so any other concept like is there, are there things that this work tells you about kind of the structure of representations in a model with regard to concepts in particular?
Yeah, I think there's some of that. There's not something that directly tells you, or at least if there is, it's not coming to my mind of something like an experiment that would directly kind of like address that. But there's a lot in terms of structure. So one of the other striking examples is this sort of like math example. So you ask Claude to do like mental math. Essentially, like we ask it 36 plus 59, and we ask it to do it in one forward pass, so it can't sort of like write out the actual like longhand addition algorithm or whatever. And so it can do that perfectly fine. Um, and then we look at the attribution graph for this, and we see that there's this like rich structure of there's like a bunch of features that detect like this ends in
That's
six. That
surprisingly rich.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Where did it come up with that?
I know there's this sort of sense in which like it's a mix of like, wow, uh, we're really giving these models hard tasks that it has to sort of like galaxy brain invent this sort of like complex tree of like math, and also it's like not the algorithm that like you're taught in school, and it's like a weird different thing where basically like the gist of it is that it like precisely kind of like determines the last digit. It's like, this definitely ends in five. And then has this other path that's just like, it's like kind of, roughly in the 80s or in the 90s and like combines both.
In you give a specific example of this, and this is like the adding 6 and 9. And it, did you do any kind of ablation or something to identify that those pathways aren't specific to like the 6 and the 9 being such a strong signal in the training data that like, you subtract one from the number if you're adding by 9, that kind of thing?
Totally. So you were asking about structure, right? Which is how we got on this point, and that's why this example I think is like a really good one because um, in the circuit tracing paper, uh, we have this like addition case study that we're talking about, and then we have the next section which is global weights, and it's something we haven't gotten a chance to talk about much here, but it's like if you're replacing this model, you might ask not just like what's happening on a given prompt, but to your point, like what's the general way that it adds numbers? Like, is it adding 6 and 9 differently from when it adds like 2 and 3? Are those kind of like all using completely different stuff? Or is there kind of like shared pathways? We saw that there are shared pathways in like languages, right? And so is there sort of like a shared set of algorithms? And we've actually like shared this, um, we've computed all of these edges between features, not just on a prompt, but in general for math, like all of the ones that we could find by asking Claude to basically do like addition for every, I think, number below 100 or something. And we took all of the features that were present, and then we made this like little app that you can use. It's like a little cute app where it like connects, it shows you the graph of all of them, and you essentially see kind of like, oh, like 6 plus 9. There's like a 6 plus 9, and then it's like I'm gonna say 15, and that one, if you look at like what are its other inputs, oh well, it's 7 plus 8, and it's like all of the like other additions also have that same pattern where they have these like same inputs, um, and so there's like basically a structure here where it's doing these addition problems in like very similar ways, no matter what the operands are. And you can see that structure, and you can kind of like see the like paths for kind of whatever you would give it.
I think that last example is a good segue to mentioning something that I really struggled with when first starting to read the circuit tracing paper. And that was really around part of it was like the anthropomorphization of the model, and talking about the model's strategies and the model's decisions and things like that. And like, with the example of the poetry, the model doing planning, and trying to reconcile this idea of a strategy and planning with, um, initially like a technical, understanding of inference and how inference works. And it's like relatively simplistic, deterministic kind of, pass through or straight through, process. And it took a while to like really get the idea that like, while the model is doing the generation and inference, the strategies are, you know, they come into the model through training. And it's an interesting relationship. Like a model is and I think this math example, really illustrates it. Like, there, you're adding, two numbers smaller than 100, and there are hundreds and hundreds of strategies that are kind of there dormant in all of these, vectors and weights in the model. And, somehow in inference, the right ones kind of fire up. And, that is the embodiment of this strategy, as opposed to like, during inference, the model, I don't know, it's like the initial read gave me the impression of, a model like actively choosing in a way, uh, and maybe a very anthropomorphized way of like choosing a strategy. And it's not really like that. I'm like reconciling all that, took a few passes for me.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's just sort of like really interesting. Like on the surface, this is like a vocabulary question or something. Like, is it planning? Is it adequate to say that it's planning? What does it mean to plan? Do you sort of like, are we implying something about something that's not there when we say, it's planning, or it's sort of like has algorithms for addition? Um, but I think, underlying that question is sort of, yeah, a really fundamental, like, how should we think and how should we describe like what these models are doing? Clearly, they're able to do very complex things. Like I think, um, a sense in which when I've talked to these results to my friends, they were like less surprised than I was. When I was like, look, like there's planning. They'd be like, well, like Claude writes my emails and my code. Like, of course it plans. Like,
Yeah.
it has to plan. Like, how would it ever do any of the things that it's doing without planning, right? Um, and I think in that colloquial sense, it seems kind of fine to say like, well, yeah, the model like imported this library when it wrote the snippet because it was planning to write code that was using it. At least that's never sort of like struck me as like maybe contentious as a vocabulary choice. Um, and at the same time, here we're like at the opposite scale, right? Like going from the behavioral to the micro, and we're saying like, well, what are we saying? We're saying like there's um, circuitry that seems general that consistently um, generates candidate uh, words for sort of like many words ahead of time, and then uses these candidates to sort of like decide, like reasoning backwards, right? Like deciding from the candidate how the sentence should be structured such that it arrives at that candidate. And like that's just a description of a mechanism. There's no, anthropomorphizing. Like that's just a thing that's happening. And then you can sort of say like, well, that's planning
But
or
a token at a time in the forward direction.
yeah, yeah, somehow. Well, and which by the way, I feel like is sort of like somewhat like more impressive or like definitely like surprising that like the model's doing backwards planning and is forward past 5 tokens ahead of
Right.
time.
No,
Um,
absolutely.
but to your point, like I think there is an interesting question of like, okay, well, these are pretty complex mechanisms for addition as well, right? They're like pretty complex algorithms that are being implemented. Um, does that mean like that definitely means that it's tempting to like draw parallels with how I would write a poem or how, I would like add numbers really quickly in my head without actually like writing it out. Um, and that sort of we also want to be mindful of not anthropomorphizing for anthropomorphizing's sake. But I think sometimes there's been, you know, it's actually like I'll maybe pose it back to you. Like if the poem example, if it's not planning, then like what is it? It's sort of hard, I think, to find the right vocabulary here. And I think maybe I'll say one more thing here that I think is really important, which is that I think that's part of the reason why I'm excited about mech interp in general is that we've had debates for a very long time where it's like, are they, stochastic parrots? Like, do they, just like kind of like match to the most similar training data? Like, or do they like generalize? What is generalization? What does that even mean? And I think what's really cool about this work, what really like gets me excited is we can just talk about the mechanism and then we can debate like, you know, what what does it mean that this is the mechanism? But we can at least start from a common ground and be like, cool, like this is how an LLM like writes a poem. Now we can have a debate and say like, well, what do we think this is? What would we want to call it? How we want to characterize it? But I feel like it's sort of like giving us much more solid ground than just a sort of like behavioral, like ask some riddles and see if the model succeeds or fails, and based on that decide whether they're like super intelligence or dumb robots or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, a couple of things in the results struck me as, if not strongly, at least lightly contradictory. Like the idea that, um, one of the examples, one of the conclusions, or the poetry example, like the conclusion is that, like, Claude is doing planning and it kind of knows where it's going once, even before it starts, spitting out tokens. But then there's another result, and I forget which example this comes from, that talks. I think it's maybe the names and Michael Jordan stuff. It talks about like forward pressure to maintain the coherence of ideas.
I think it's the
Um,
jailbreak example.
Jailbreak example, okay. And so you can maybe explain that before as you're going into this, but like, or even thinking about the general problem of hallucination. um, it seems like the idea that like the model kind of knows where it's going and has this concrete destination, is a little bit at odds with the idea that it's just kind of following the wave of momentum of, the tokens that it's generating, or, that it would end up in a place that, even the jailbreaking example specifically speaks to this, like end up in a place, going down this path that it doesn't want to go to, and then like somehow realizing it and like correcting itself. Speak a little bit to that.
So yeah, maybe I'll like just briefly recap the jailbreak example, but like essentially the jailbreak example in the paper is one where you get Claude to like basically spell out bomb and start a sentence that's like to make a bomb, and then it's going to keep telling you how to do it. And the finding there, that the thing that's kind of fun. Well, there's a few findings, but specifically for that part is you're like, well, why does like Claude has been trained to not tell you how to make a bomb? Like, why is it continuing to be like, oh, you do this? Um, well, first, it turns out that it continues to tell you until it hits a period. And then it starts being like, oh, I'm so sorry. Should not have said that. Definitely don't make a bomb. Um, and so we like looked at circuits for like, well, before it hits the period when it's telling you all these instructions, like why? And there's two paths. And one path is just sort of like, hey, I'm talking about bombs. That's harmful. I am a harmless assistant. I should not be doing that. And that path like upweights various tokens like saying I, which often is like the start of refusal. So it's like I apologize. But then there's another path which happens to be stronger, which is I am a language model that writes correct text and I need to have like a correct grammatical sentence. And I'm in the middle of explaining that, like you mix this chemical with that chemical and really like I should have like a tertiary clause to that before I like have a period or whatever. And so the model is like, in a way, there's just like a demon inside it that's just like compelling it to be like, no, you need. Okay, I actually like. I'm realizing I'm saying demon inside it. Forget I said that. That's even worse than anthropomorphizing. But there's like two paths inside it, um, and like one path is stronger than the other. And to your point, like at the same time, we say, in the like poetry example, there's this sort of like remarkably, let's say, like not next token prediction sounding mechanism. But I don't think those are contradictory. If anything, I think they sort of like they make a lot of sense because I think an experience of using language models and building them is that they're incredibly good at some tasks that if like a human was good at that task at that level, you would assume that they would also be good at this other task, but it turns out that actually they can't do this other task. And so they have this sort of like jagged set of capabilities, right? Where they can do some stuff, they can't do some stuff. And I think that mechanisms like this sort of show you like, yes, okay, in this example, it's learned something that's like robust, this like planning example. That's really going to be helpful to just generate poems. That's like a good kind of thing. And then in the jailbreak example, I would say it's unclear to me whether like it's like like a bad mechanism or at least like it's just like this weird like the model's trying to do two things at once, and we see this. It's a motif we have almost always that there's like many different paths converging or like competing sometimes, and then the model kind of like ends up like having to choose between one of them. And then maybe I'll mention one more thing, which is your like hallucination example, because I actually think that's an example of like a bad, in my opinion, a bad mechanism. In that, like, what we found was if you ask the model about someone, like, who's Emmanuel, who's like Michael Jordan, who's Michael Batkin, like, there's kind of two different circuits. First, there's a circuit that determines whether the model like knows or doesn't know the person. And the way that circuit works is like by default, Claude just doesn't know. Like the circuit is off by default. It will always refuse. But if like there are enough features in the name or in the context, there's like basically like a different circuit that will inhibit that like I don't know, and the model decides to answer. But the kicker is that circuit is separate from the circuit that's actually like retrieving information about the person and then like telling you stuff. And so then, it's possible for it to like recognize the person enough that like it's like, okay, I'm going to answer. But then when it gets to the point that like there's separate circuits to like do factual recall, it just makes stuff up because it actually doesn't know. Like a way better mechanism would be first you retrieve stuff about the person, and then conditioned on that, you decide whether you're going to like accept or not. That's, what we do. If you ask me who X is, I'll be like, nope, doesn't ring a bell. But Claude has sort of like this, like two separate mechanisms where there's like one that says like, no, you definitely know who this is, but that it was somehow not connected to like the like actual like retrieval of the other one. And so I think that's like, again, I wouldn't say that's contradictory. I would say like that's an example of the many facets of like these mechanisms that exist in these models, and that some of them are, surprisingly advanced, and some of them are like surprisingly just like silly and kind of we kind of are getting to see how the sausage is made a little bit, understand some of the reasons for why sometimes these behaviors are really cool or perplexing.
In this Michael Jordan, Michael Batkin example, you mentioned in the paper, kind of in passing, that for whatever reason, Claude thinks that Michael Batkin is a chess player. Like it hallucinates that quite consistently, I think was the term that was used. Um, any investigation into why that might be? And did these tools, tell you like why chess of all things?
I personally haven't looked at this much. I don't know that anyone on the team has. I can offer you wild speculation, which I'm always happy to offer. But in prior work, I think it was we posted like we do these monthly updates, and we did one maybe like almost a year ago about sort of like asking a smaller model, you know, uh, blah plays the sport of X, and we did notice that when the model is like saying a sport for somebody that doesn't know, there are just like common biases. If I remember well, like for male names, it was golf. It's like if the model didn't know, it was just going to guess golf. And so I think one wild speculation here is like there's like a mix of just say something that's a sport, and maybe chess is like relatively high on the list. And then there's maybe also, this is again wild speculation, but something to do with the features of the name. Maybe there's like some bias where it's like, maybe it sounds like a Russian chess player. But yeah, we didn't investigate it carefully.
I think we covered a lot of the examples from the biology paper. Any others that jump out at you?
Yeah, we went through a lot. I think let's see. I think maybe that the one thing, yeah, actually there is one thing that I think is like maybe interesting to mention. And that's the what we call the chain of thought faithfulness one. Um so that one is one where, there's these reasoning models and these thinking models that like will explain to you what they're doing. And um, you know, it feels like kind of important that we should be able to trust this reasoning. And it turns out that there's other papers on this, but in we have a case study that's sort of like studying an example where the model is just like not being faithful. And the example is sort of you ask it a really hard question, like a really hard math question, and it's like cosine of like 2,343 or whatever, something it can't do. Um, and by default, first of all, it'll just like make up a number that's between 0 and 1, I think, and it'll just like say, that number. Um, but if in the prompt you tell it like, oh, I worked this out by hand and I got X, like, do you think that's right? And you look at the circuit, the model will actually like look at the hint you gave it and work backwards from that hint to like say something that will lead it to the answer that you gave it as a hint. And like you see this when we look at the attribution graph. But to be clear, the model is like telling you that it like calculated that this cosine is equals to, it turns out, exactly what it needed so that it landed on the answer that you gave it. And so that's sort of like an example of like the model clearly um, not, you know, uh, not like a clear difference between like what the model is writing in its chain of thought and like the mechanism through which it actually wrote it. And I think that that's sort of like was quite compelling to me because it's just like, there's a question where it's like, well, do we need to do interp at all if the model just tells you what it's going to do? So just like listen to the model, you know. But it turns out that in many cases, there there are actually discrepancies between what the model says and what it doesn't. You can imagine like a bunch of reasons why you would very much want to know that like if the model is making a very high stakes decision and is telling you it's because of this reasoning, it's not because of this completely unrelated reason.
Yeah, I found that this result less surprising than some of the others. Mostly, I think because it, um, it just I think vibe with a lot of our experience with these models, like and some of the early jailbreaking work, like you can kind of convince the model of things that it should know, aren't right, or to do things that it should know aren't right. And when I think about what I see in those thought traces, I think of it as just the generation of tokens, inside of some delimiter, as opposed to something that has some, you know, very significant, meaning, like, some deeper, thought meaning. So it didn't surprise me that you can mislead a model so much, but the implications that those things are not mechanistic interpretability signals, I think is important.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you mentioned sort of like it as like misleading the model because my frame was like the model misleading you. But I mean I think they're equivalent, but there's this sort of sense in which here, like I think this almost to me like rhymes with reward hacking a little bit, right? Where you've told it the answer you'd like to get. And so there's certainly like a bunch of circuits in the model that will be like, well, like, Emmanuel said that he got
I'm a
four,
helpful
probably if I get,
assistant.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, but to your point, yeah, I think there's like maybe like a broader theme here that like if you've played with LLMs a lot, like a lot of these results that I said, you'd be like, yeah, like it plans more than one token at a time. Like, yeah, sometimes you can't trust its chain of thought. And so I think there's kind of like two maybe sets of kind of like takeaways, which is like one is if you haven't played with these models, I think a lot of this stuff is like quite surprising. And if you were under like if you haven't seen or played with them like for like 2 or 3 years, and you'd be like, oh, they're sort of like I think the complexity that's embedded inside them is like more nuanced. And then if you have played with them and you sort of like have good priors for a lot of this stuff, I think then it's kind of what I was talking about earlier. It's like the thing that's exciting is like now we get to not just say like, yes, it makes sense that like you can like mislead the model in this way, but it's like this is exactly the circuit and like the causal structure through which the model is being misled by your hint.
This work falls under the banner, as we've mentioned multiple times, of interpretability and understanding what the models that we have are doing. Projecting forward, though, how do you see this work as um, influencing the way we build future models? Like, do the things, in what ways do you see the things that we're learning here changing the way that, you know, Claude 4.2 is going to be built or whatever?
Bold of you to assume that there'll be a Claude 4.2. It'll be Claude 3.7 new. Um, but I think interp is part of our sort of like
I
safety.
thought we were behind those naming challenges.
No, I think this is the sign of any LLM company needs to have a few choice naming decisions. But I think interp is one of our um, sort of it's part of our safety portfolio here. And so, like one example again in the like biology is there was this auditing game that was run recently where a model was sort of like acting strangely. It turns out it had been trained to act strangely, but in a way that's kind of like not obvious. And my hope, and I think like the team's hope is that like tools like interp can help with things like that. Like in the case of that game, interp was helpful. You could also do like kind of like figure out what was wrong with the model without interp. But I think for like complex like reward hacking behavior or like behavior where we might just notice that the model is like acting strangely and be concerned about the implications of that, about like what does it mean that the model is like acting strangely in these contexts, being able to sort of like actually explain the mechanisms through which it's acting that way. Um, Sort of like as a like auditing step feels really valuable to have as part of just like any sort of like model auditing pipeline before you decide like to release it and like the extent to which you feel comfortable releasing it. Um, I think there's also like, I'd mentioned when we started this conversation, and there's sort of like a 3-step plan, and we're kind of on step 2. I think a third step, or something that we've been interested in for a while, is sort of also teasing out like not just um, explanations for why did Claude do this in this example, but like global structure from the model. Something closer to the addition example where I mentioned we kind of like mapped out how it adds like all of the numbers, from like 0 to 100. Like you could imagine doing that in many other domains. You know, how does Claude write code generally? Can we have like an understanding at a bit more of a macro level of, like roughly the pathways? It's like, this is kind of like the part that tends to think to like have like mechanisms to deal with like control flow. This is the part that, tends to decide on whether you're going to do object oriented stuff or not. I think that things of that shape seem like they could also be much more directly useful to kind of evaluating how models are working, if they're working well, if they're working poorly. And they're kind of also rhyming with some of the multilingual stuff, like trying to see if there are shared representations when you'd expect that there were. I think is also sort of like something um, that like can help you debug, like, oh, maybe the reason like the model's behaving strangely is because it hasn't made like a connection to these two things, where it has.
So I think what I didn't hear in there is any strong, like, we learned this and that's going to influence, that, or we expect it to. And maybe, the way to think about that or contextualize that is kind of going back to the fundamentals of, like, all of these properties are not design properties. They're emergent properties that came about when take a lot of data and put it through some training recipe. And, we're not, uh, we're not going to take things that we learn here and necessarily, like, re-architect a model to do different things or build. Like, I'm thinking about, like, maybe hallucination, for example, or even the addition thing. Like, you've learned some things that could be interesting if you really wanted to, if you could figure out a way to tinker and build, like, subsystems in a model to, like, better do thing XYZ. But, maybe that's, that flies in the face of a lot of kind of the idea of end-to-end training, based only on data and not trying to, like, overly manually engineer features, like kind of old world ML versus, new world ML, right?
Yeah, I'm learning that you're not bitter lesson pilled yet. Yeah. Um, well, I think okay, so I think unclear to me the extent to which kind of, yeah, like these, like, graphed on something to do math. Like, that's kind of outside of my wheelhouse. But it's also the case that um we really, like, as I mentioned, interp for us is really like a part of our safety strategy. And so that's the main goal. So the main goal is understand the model. Um I think also, like, this is early days. We're really excited about this set of papers. We think that sort of um you know, it opens up a lot of biology questions. I think it's also still just, like, very early to sort of make any sort of claim about we've learned, like, this fundamental truth about how the model does things and have strong opinions that it shouldn't do it that way. Um, but yeah, but the main thing that we have insight
That's very
in is sort
reasonable.
of, yeah, it's sort of like, let's keep pushing on understanding the models better, and through that understanding, on sort of, again, kind of like being more confident in, like, our pre-deployment testing. I think is, like, like, sort of the main things that we're concerned with here, where, like, detecting, yeah, reward hacking, various forms of, like, misalignment, things like that. I think we have a line of sight on and are pretty excited about.
Well, Manu, it's been great catching up, and this is super exciting research, and I appreciate, all of the explanations and the time you took to go through them with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'll see you, I guess, in 3 years.
Hopefully we can increase the cadence or something.
Sounds good to me.
All right, thanks so much.